Good morning, everybody joining us. Welcome. We'll just wait for a short while so that everybody can enter into the room, so to speak, and then we'll get started. Well, I think we can get started. So first of all, welcome everyone. And my name is Chris Kilford, and I'm the president of the Canadian International Council branch here on Vancouver Island. I'd like to say welcome again, and for our Turkish friends in the audience, hoş geldiniz. And for our Canadian International Council members, both in Victoria and across the country, and Jeremy, our guest speaker, I'm glad that you are all able to join us today. Before we do start, it's important to recognize that CIC Victoria members live, work, and learn on the unceded Coast Salish territory, and we give our thanks to the Lekwungen people, who are now known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, for allowing us to meet on their traditional lands. Now, for those of you that are not CIC members here today, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank with an express mandate to engage Canadians on issues concerning Canada and what's happening internationally. And what's making us that little bit different from normal think tanks, if you like, is the fact that we do have a national office in Toronto, but we have branches in 18 cities across the country with some 1,400 members. And I always like to say that we have a big group of those members here on Vancouver Island, and you can find out more about the CIC by Googling the Canadian International Council. We also run the foreign policy digital magazine, Open Canada. And if you do want to know more about what we do, I've in the chat area put my email address, so you can email me directly and I'd be happy to talk to you about CIC. And if you're not a member, how to become one. So how are we going to handle today? Well, I'm really quite excited about this. First of all, after I introduce our guest speaker, Jeremy and I will chat about his new book, Coup in Turkey, A Tale of Democracy, Despotism and Vengeance in a Divided Land, in which he investigated the 1960 military coup, which led to then Prime Minister Adnan Menderes being overthrown by a small group of military officers and eventually executed. We'll have Jeremy and I will chat, and then we will have time also for a Q&A portion. And for this, if you just scroll down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A area where you can put your questions there, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. We're also recording this event for those that aren't able to join us today. And afterwards, we'll be selecting 3 randomly chosen CIC Victoria members who will then receive a copy of Jeremy's new book, which I have a copy of positioned over my shoulder. And we're still waiting for those 3 copies to come in, but they will, and then we will get them to you. So let's begin. First of all, Jeremy, welcome. And
thank you so much, Chris. Thank you.
Oh, yes. And I have to tell everybody that you are a travel writer, you're a teacher, you're a broadcaster, tour guide with a lifelong fascination for Turkey. And I have a copy of your first book, A Fez of the Heart, which was shortlisted for Thomas Cook's Travel Book Award. And it traced the history of the cone-shaped fez hat, which was banned in Turkey in 1925. And Jeremy's written for a whole host of newspapers, and also importantly, something I'm looking forward to, he organizes and leads cultural tours to Turkey. So Jeremy, welcome.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you. Yeah.
How are you?
I'm very well. I'm UK based for all of you who I can't see, but hello to all of you. And thank you so much for finding time for us today. Thank you.
So for our audience, and before we do delve into your book, it's something I just wanted to talk about because both of us have a passion for Turkey and Turkish history. My grandfather fought at Gallipoli in 1915 with the British Middlesex Regiment. I studied Ottoman and early Turkish history when I was doing my PhD, and then later I had the honor of serving as defense attaché to Turkey from 2011 to 2014, and I've been back 3 times since then. But Jeremy, you've had a much longer connection to Turkey, and I'd like just to hear a little bit more about how your love of all things Turkish began. And I think it began in 1984. So tell us about this.
I have no family connection with Turkey whatsoever. And it was entirely fortuitous that I ended up there. I left university in 84 with no idea of what to do. Everybody else seemed to be going off to become accountants or solicitors or trade in whatever field it was. And so I threw myself into teaching English as a foreign language, trained myself, and was offered a post in Ankara, which I took despite not knowing where it was. This was 1984. I was a young man. I had no real sense of what Turkey would offer up for me, but I went anyway. So I took a 1-year posting and arrived in Ankara, the capital, in September of 1984. And I think basically fell in love with the place very, very quickly. I think I was kind of predisposed to that part of the world. My father had been the naval attaché in Cairo, it so happened. So I already had a love for things Egyptian and Arabic. And Turkey was just, if you like, the next aspect of that. I think within days of landing, I was falling in love, of course, with the food, which I adore, of course, with the people, with the landscapes, but especially, I think, with that incredible, abundant sense of culture, historical culture particularly, which has always been my subject. I studied English literature, it so happens, at university, but I was very keen on history and on archaeology. And for me, discovering Turkey in 1984, when very few people, at least from Britain, were visiting at that stage, was extremely exciting. And I quite quickly got that sense that the old cliche that Turkey represents a bridge between East and West wasn't really the half of it. It seemed to me that it was more the kind of nexus of a crossroads, another word that's used about Turkey, not only East and West, so you've got Persia and ancient Greece, but actually North and South as well, which is Russia and Arabia. So a country at the heart of all those 4 cultures, inspired by those 4 cultures, but also to a degree infected by it as well as being its own place, was just so exciting to me. And I very quickly, having abandoned teaching, at least temporarily after a year's post, resolved that I would get back to Turkey by crook or by hook or by crook, and actually gradually slipped into travel writing, because fortuitously Turkey was undergoing a huge boom in travel writing, at least in the UK at the time, travel journalism, I mean, because people were beginning to discover it. So I had this built-in excuse to return time and again, and very quickly developed an extraordinary enthusiasm and passion for the place, which I'm so glad to say remains with me to this day. Yeah.
And you arrived in 1984. It was it was still, well, a military government had been in place up until about 1983 because of the coup in 1980, although your book is not about the 1980 coup. But in your book, you describe an Ankara that we wouldn't recognize today.
Yes. I can't believe that it's the best part of 35, a little bit over 35 years ago that I was there. And it's obviously much enlarged since then. But it was a place that almost uniquely I fell in love with. A lot of people don't like Ankara. They have their reasons for doing so. There is this kind of huge bias, particularly amongst Turks, towards Istanbul, and for good reason, I suppose. But I felt that Ankara was a really interesting place, and it was also a fantastic stepping stone for traveling to all points of the compass, from there, being effectively almost in the center of the country. So yeah, it became my base. It became a place that I became very interested in, and of course, it's one of those places which tells very interestingly in terms of the book that I come onto. It's worth saying that what followed from my travel journalism, which began, I suppose, in the early 90s, was a couple of earlier travelogues that I wrote. The one you mentioned, Chris, Affairs of the Heart, which was published in 1995. And then there was another one more recently, 2012, which is a book called Meander, which is a travelogue whereby I take a canoe down the Meander River, the Buk Menderes, a river that is the byword, if you like, for indirection. And it seemed to me like a wonderful metaphor for exploring the country. But that said, those two books were, broadly speaking, extremely positive about the country, and they were not, broadly speaking, contentious in the way that, for various reasons, this latest book obviously is. So I suppose it's true to say that at some point there's been a change in my approach towards Turkey, and for reasons that we can perhaps discuss.
Yeah, that gives us a great segue into your book, which does focus on Adnan Menderes and his life and times following the first free and fair elections. And I know a lot of our audience members, well, they haven't had a chance to read your book and probably need a little bit of background. So having said that, what we have for the audience members, and I'm going to share my screen right now, is we have this slide here for you with our cast of characters, if you like, which are fundamental to Jeremy's story. On the left-hand side, you can see the front cover of Jeremy's latest book, and you can see Adnan Menderes, and coming out from behind also Turkey's current president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and we'll have a chance to talk about why he's there later on, I think, Jeremy.
Yeah.
But for our audience members, what you also see beside the book cover in the top area on the left side is Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, Turkey's very famous First World War and War of Independence, Turkish independence officer, military officer, who also founded the Turkish Republic in October of 1923. And below him is his wartime colleague, İsmet İnönü, who became president of Turkey after Mustafa Kemal Ataturk died in 1938. And İsmet İnönü led Turkey through the Second World War, keeping Turkey neutral right to the very end. And it was İsmet İnönü who in 1950, in the elections at that time, lost power to Adnan Menderes. And you can see Adnan Menderes just to the right with the airplane in the background, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And Adnan Menderes was the Prime Minister of Turkey up until May of 1960, when he was overthrown in a military coup. And just to the bottom right, you'll see two very important military figures. On the radio, there is Colonel Turkesh announcing that a coup has taken place, and he would go on to found the MHP party, which still exists today in Turkey. And staging a coup back in 1960 was far easier because there was just one radio station, no social media, no television. So controlling the message was a lot easier. As the military that portion of the military who tried to carry out the coup in 2016 found out. And to his right is General Gürsel, who eventually came out of retirement. He was the former army commander in Turkey, and he led then the National Unity Committee, which took over control of Turkey for about a year. So there's your leading figures. It's important to know this. And then Jeremy, you have a second slide here. Which
before we go to that, Chris, can I make a few observations about
yes.
the past? Yeah.
Yes, please.
I was just going to say that it's probably worth talking a little bit about what we might call the two ideological political camps that have emerged in Turkey. And of course, the point about Ataturk, who came to proper power in 1922, and indeed İnönü, who was his right-hand man, the man underneath him, and who effectively took over after Ataturk's death in 1938, is that they were both staunch modernizers in the secularist camp, Kemalists as we call them. And it may be said that the two of them together absolutely established what is tantamount to being the sacred vision of the country in terms of being secularist and Western looking. And indeed, the two army officers at the bottom of the screen would also subscribe to a similar, broadly speaking, position. And I know we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves at the moment, but the other two people who appear on that screen, which is both Menderes and Erdogan, broadly speaking, again, would be considered to be from the opposing camp, which only really emerged properly from 1950 with what are regarded as the first fair democratic elections. The first moment, if you like, when the people were able to express their view of the radical secularist reform program, which had been in operation in Turkey from 1922 right through actually until the 1940s. And I think Menderes coming to power in 1950 is a reflection of the fact that one thing we don't really understand is that while there was a great deal of support for Ataturk, particularly as a soldier, and to a degree for everything that he stood for in terms of his revolutionary approach to modernizing the country, there was also a reactionary, considerable portion of the population who felt, to a degree at least, uneasy with the imposition of those radical reforms. And I think that Menderes and latterly Erdogan are absolutely a reflection of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really great observations. And this second slide, I think, was very important to your undertaking the book.
It was indeed. I mean, this is actually the slide I saw that actually got me interested in the story of Adnan Menderes and the 1950s, that particular decade. I mean, it strikes me as really interesting and helpful that he comes to power in 1950, right at the middle of the 20th century. That's always helpful for those of us who can't remember dates. I was aware of Menderes from my previous book, which, as I say, was the journey that I took by canoe down the Meander. And in fact, Menderes is the Turkish for meander. And it reflects the fact that Adnan Menderes was from the River Valley, from that particular area of southwest Turkey. His family was from there. And when in 1934, as one of the great radical reforms that we've already discussed, Turks were required to take Western-style surnames, Adnan Menderes took the name Menderes. He was known as Ali Adnan before then, and there wasn't, if you like, what we would consider to be a surname. Now, what we're seeing here is a photograph that I came across when I was on a walk in, I think, 2013. I was walking in the backcountry in Turkey, and I was actually writing an article for a magazine about a newly opened walking trail. So it was for some tourism pages. And we were stopped in a little village by an old gentleman called Mehmet, who invited us in. And we went in, and the house was very ramshackle, but he was as kind as most Turks are. He invited us upstairs. We sat down in a room which was very ramshackle. His wife brewed us a cup of tea. And as we sat there, we noticed that on the walls, there were all these pictures of, mostly of his family, of Mehmet's family, various pictures of son going off to do military service, grandchildren, and the rest. And in the midst of it, I noticed this picture, which was actually distinguished by the fact it was in this gilt frame. And I could tell pretty immediately that these must be public figures. And I was struck by that because one of the things that anybody who knows Turkey well will understand is that the iconography, the political iconography, is almost absolutely monopolized, and certainly was in 1984 and until recently by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. He's the only figure you really see, apart from increasingly now, Mr. Erdogan. I saw this photograph and I was very struck by it, and I got Mehmet to explain to me what it was. And he told me that here was Mr. Menderes admiring the model of a mosque with 3 other men. And of course, in the iconography of Turkey, Ataturk would never be seen admiring a model of a mosque. It was absolutely inconceivable. It's simply not part of what he stands for. And it was also important that he was admiring it in the company of the 3 men to his, as we look to his left, but to his right. And actually working from the left, the oldest gentleman is the president of the time up until 1960, Celal Bayar. And then there are 2 ministers whose names are Hasan Palatkan, who was the finance minister, and Fatin Rushduzolu, who was the foreign minister. And I think it's actually, looking at it closely, it's probably an early example of a photoshopping, in that I'm not sure that in the original photograph, all the men were like that in that position. So it's been put together, if you like, as a kind of collage for a very, very real reason, which we will come on to a moment, because those four men are absolutely central to the story. But it got me thinking about how interesting it was that there was this other figure who was revered, in this case by this old man in this village, who seemed to suggest that there was another story I didn't know very, very well, the counter story to the Ataturk story, which was all about the population being broadly and avowedly behind the reform program. This gave me the suggestion that something else was going on. And what Mehmet finally said was, he said something like, "The blessed Menderes, what they did to him," and raised his eyebrows, which told me that there was a story that needed to be told. So that was the trigger, if you like, for me beginning to explore this story, which I quickly discovered a lot of Turks, of course, know about, but it isn't really known in the West. And I think there are all sorts of interesting reasons why that should be.
Thank you. And I'll just stop the share. We know, and we've mentioned, that Menderes came to power in 1950. There were elections in 1946, but they were not judged to be free and fair, as you know. But he does come to power in 1950, and he's there until he's overthrown in 1960. Your book, though, starts off with Adnan Menderes traveling to the United Kingdom in 1959 on a Turkish Airlines flight that crashes on its final approach to Gatwick Airport. Can you talk to us
Sure.
about why you decided to start the book off with that story?
Sure.
Because it also involves then his reception back in Turkey afterwards, because
it surely
survived.
does. I mean, for me, that incident, although it comes quite late in the story, and although it happens a long way from home, at least for him, is absolutely central to indicating so many of the issues that are at play at this stage. He's flying into London with a delegation, with an official delegation, to oversee the independence agreement, the signing of the independence agreement for Cyprus, because of course this is 1959. Britain is beginning to dispose of her imperial assets, and this is a very important moment. There's been a lot of very good work done by Zorlu, the foreign minister, on behalf of the Turks and the Greeks as well, to come to an agreement over Cyprus. The plane doesn't make it. It's diverted in thick fog from Heathrow, the main airport, to Gatwick, the second airport, and it comes down in the trees. And of the 24 people on board, 14 die, most of them outright. And this is witnessed by a local farmer's wife, whose name is Margaret Bailey, who hears, she's feeding the chickens on a February night. She hears this enormous crash in the woods nearby, and she and her husband drive out to find out what's going on. And as they get out of the car, they are greeted by 3 men staggering out of the woods in the gloaming, in suits, battered, but actually walking. And one of them, it transpires, is Prime Minister Menderes. Margaret Bailey and her husband look after the 3. They organize the rescue mission. And what happens 2 weeks later is, by the time Mr. Menderes returns to Turkey 2 weeks later, there is an extraordinary sense not only of national mourning for the people who've been lost, 14 of the 24, some of them very high-ranking and important official figures, but there's this other thing going on, which is this extraordinary euphoric sense that Adnan Menderes has not only survived, but there is this belief that there may be a divine hand in his survival. And there's this remarkable scene at Ankara station where his train arrives on the last day of February 1959, 2 weeks after the crash, where he's greeted by huge crowds of his followers. And a lot of them are country people who've brought with them livestock, oxen, sheep, goats, and in some cases camels. And as he gets off the train, all these people begin to sacrifice these animals to give thanks for the fact that he, in their judgment, has just been saved by Allah from death in an English wood. And this not only represents how strongly the feeling was, how strong the feeling was for him amongst his own constituency, which we'll talk about in a minute, but it also gives us a sense of just how unacceptable, how unconscionable this would have been for the secularists, for the people whose belief was in Ataturk, for İnönü himself, who was still the leader of the opposition at that stage. This is exactly what they have devoted their lives to preventing, these scenes of primitive reaction and superstition, which Menderes is at the heart of. And I think, for me, although it's never actually stated, that it may just be that moment when the opposition to Menderes see him with these extraordinary scenes, surrounded by followers who believe he is actually chosen by Allah, chosen by God, that they think that from that point that they finally decide they're going to move against him. That's just my hunch. Mm-hmm. It's worth saying something, I think, about the constituency that he's built from 1950, which is broadly speaking, as I say, the opposition to the Kemalist idea, which is often rural-based, not necessarily so well-educated people, farming people, devout, traditional in their views, in opposition to the other side. And this is the constituency that he builds from 1950 right through to 1960, not least by increasingly offering more space in the national debate and indeed in Turkish public life for the public place of Islam in that life. And that is absolutely at the heart of what he comes to stand for, increasingly as the decade goes on, but also what the army, among other reasons, finds fault for him for.
So, following along on that, the late 1940s, the early 1950s, they're regarded by some as the golden years, or described as golden years. Turkey became a member of the Council of Europe. It joined NATO in 1952. Troops were sent to Korea to fight in that war. Things were going actually really well. That early part of Menderes' time in power, sort of 1950 to roughly 1954, it just looked, American assistance was coming in. I mean, it really looked good for Turkey. But in 1954, you discuss this in the book, 1954 was a turning point, if you like, which created challenging conditions for Turkey. Can you talk to us about why that period was important?
Yeah, I think it changes in 1954. The other thing to add in relation to the years previous to that, 1950 through to 1954, is that the luck is with Menderes and his Democrat Party because the weather's very good, and he enjoys a series of terrific harvests, which helps the economy no end, and which puts his followers, many of whom are farming people who get subsidies for the grain that they grow, in a very, very good position. And he's able to transform the lives of people in the villages over those years, not only because the weather's very good and the harvests are very good, but also because using American aid, he's able to deliver piped water to the villages. He's able to develop tarmacked roads, health provision. The life in the villages, which prior to 1950 was really, really basic, becomes transformed to an extraordinary degree. And that underpins, if you like, his support and his base. But in 1954, it starts to go wrong, not least because the weather goes off and he suffers a series of very bad harvests. And it's quickly clear that the economy goes into a nosedive, not least because of that, but also because he's embarked on an enormous infrastructure project bankrolled by the Americans to build new ports, as I've mentioned, everything in the villages, new cold storage depots, factories, any number of infrastructural projects across the country, and mosques as well. And suddenly it becomes clear that there's a hole in the national finances, and it becomes very difficult. The lira has to be devalued, there is a shortage of money, and suddenly all the products which are being, the foreign goods are in very short supply. And people begin to turn against him. There is a strong feeling that he no longer has quite the support he did have, or at least the very clear break between, on the one side, those who support him, who tend to be from the villages, from the farming people, and the city folk, the educated city folk, the bureaucrats, the journalists, the lawyers, the teachers, the academics, who are all, or at least mostly, on state wages, which are falling away because of inflation. And suddenly there is this strong sense that those divisions which have always been there, which have always been latent, are increasingly apparent to people. And the army finds itself at the heart of that. And people begin to think as to whether they should, some officers begin to have discussions among themselves as to whether it's time for action to be taken.
Yeah, because I mean, he wins the 1950 election with a big majority. The 1954 election also, even with the problems that Turkey's beginning to encounter, and he also still does well in 1957 when elections are held. But the Republican Party begins to gain ground on him at that
Yes.
point. But that particular period, sort of after 1954, when you move into 55, 56, 57, the government begins really clamping down on the media and so forth. Can you talk to us about that particular period?
Yeah, I think what underpins that particular period is to do with the personality of Menderes himself, which is really fascinating. He was a man who was a mix of such contradictions. He seems to have been very charismatic. He seems to have been charming, courteous, but at the same time vindictive and hypersensitive, unable to cope with criticism. And a lot of commentators at the time and since have talked about this apparent tendency in Turkish leaders. In fact, sometimes they talk about it in terms of leaders across the Near East and the Middle East. This inability to cope with the humiliations that some people, particularly in more Western developed democracies, might feel should come with the daily round of democratic politics, democratic life. Menderes seems to find that very, very difficult to take. He adored the adoration that he got at the very beginning. He was a great one for organizing rallies at which huge crowds arrived. But the flip side of that appears to have been that when the criticism started to come, he was unable to take it, particularly in relation to the free press, which he had always stood for and supported right from the very beginning. And the press from 1955 onwards, in fact from 1954 onwards, became increasingly unfree. There were a series of new press laws which basically made it harder and harder for journalists to do their job and alienated the press from Menderes and from his government from 1955. And that actually becomes another of the elements which drives this increasingly, it appears, inevitable movement when, in retrospect, towards what happens in 1960.
You know, and yeah, exactly. In 1960, things start to come to a head, don't they? In Parliament, with Menderes and the Democrat Party now saying that they're going to investigate the CHP, or the. Why is that so important to this story?
Well, I think what happens in Parliament is actually from earlier than that, from sort of 1958. Increasingly, there are these really unseemly brawls that break out in the Parliament. And I think that's interesting as a consequence of this notion that we have to accept that although there were the first elections in 1946, they're widely regarded as not being free, fully free. And so we talk about 1950 being the first ones. And I think I get that sort of sense that democracy suddenly appeared from nowhere. I mean, obviously there had been democratic ideas bandied about right from the Ottoman period. But I think the introduction of democracy in 1946, but particularly from 1950 with the coming to power of Menderes's Democrat Party, becomes a huge surprise, not only to the electorate, but also to the politicians. They understand how democracy works in theory, but in practice, in terms of the day-to-day business of the parliament, it's a really hard thing to do. And you're suddenly going from nodding everything through to the whole business of dissent and discussion and debate on a daily basis. And I think that's why you have this increasingly fractious atmosphere in the parliament, which leads to the two sides not only at loggerheads, but actually fighting each other on a regular basis. And that happens time and again as we move into the early 1960s. The pressure starts to build. And I think the Democrats under Menderes increasingly have the sense of being embattled to the point where they decide, it appears, to take action against the opposition by organizing this council of investigation, this investigation into their activities, which it seems may be leading towards the proscription of the opposition, which would take you back to the one-party state.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, there is a real sense that if the army wanted it, this would be their excuse for intervening. The problem, of course, for the army is that Ataturk was always very, very clear that there was no place, from the moment he came to power, there was no place for the army in civilian affairs. The army was to stand back. Army officers were not even allowed to vote. So they had to come to terms with the fact that they would be going not only against the elected government of the day, but against the express wishes of Ataturk himself, which makes it even more interesting when they do make the decision to mount the coup in May of that year.
Right, on the 27th of May,
yeah,
there's a coup and suddenly Menderes is in trouble. But it's not the high command that's behind the coup, is it? It's another group of officers. Can you talk to us about how this came about and who these officers were?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of contention and unclarity about this, but it appears that sort of mid-ranking officers, often colonels and majors, and I think this is often the case, were the fomenters of the first plots to move against Menderes. And it was only later that they began to look for figureheads, five-star generals who would actually give legitimacy and weight to their plans. And the man that they eventually settle on is actually going back to the slide that you showed earlier, Chris, is General Jamal Gürsel, who's a five-star general, very highly regarded, who eventually agrees to lead, who eventually gives his backing to the coup, but obviously doesn't take any part in the action of it himself. In fact, the main troops, the main body in terms of the actual coup, which takes place on the night of the 27th of May, are the cadets, the Ankara cadets, young men who are released in the early hours onto the streets of Ankara and very quickly, operating with a few other rebel units, they take possession of all the important strategic points. And you mentioned, Chris, earlier how a coup in 1960 is very different from an attempted coup in 2016. And reports have it that, it was all over, both in Ankara and Istanbul, within an hour in each case. There was very, very little opposition. The police, such as they were, laid down their arms. The main strategic points were taken, which was the airport, railway station, a few party headquarters, post office, the National Radio building, and the presidential palace. That being done, it was a case of rounding up the usual suspects, as they say, including Menderes, so all the ministers, and latterly all the MPs, what we call MPs in Britain, the deputies, I think they're known as in Turkey, all of them, almost some 500 men, all in all, were rounded up. So it was really interesting that the Turkish junta, having made this decision, were very, very clear that they didn't want to be in any way confused with other coups which had happened more recently. For example, in Iraq in 1958, 2 years earlier, where the main ministers and the royal family had just been gunned down in sort of 1917 Bolshevik style. In fact, the coup passed off without any deliberate bloodshed whatsoever, at least not to the members of the regime, and they were all incarcerated. And it was then that the junta had to decide what they were going to do next. The junta, by the way, was known as the Committee for National Unity, the CNU, and one of the main spokespeople, as you mentioned, Chris, was Turkesh, Colonel Turkesh.
Mm-hmm.
So that gets us to there.
And what I like all of the book. What I really liked about the book is the talks you've had with so many of the key players were there at the trial, not the judges and that, but the lieutenant. I have his name here, Mehmet Tashdelen,
yes,
who was a photographer who was able to see and photograph Menderes there. So because Menderes was held in not the best conditions while he awaited trial by
Yeah.
the junta. Can you talk to us about that particular period?
Yeah, I mean, this is really fascinating. For any of you who know Istanbul, the decision was taken that all the members of the former regime, as I say, some 500 or so, were carted off to Yassıada, which is an island, a very small island in the Prince's Islands, just off Istanbul. If you stand, for example, in the gardens of the Topkapı Palace and look out, you can clearly see it there. It had been formerly a naval training base. It had fallen into disrepair, and it became the holding place, the prison, effectively, the prison island for all these ministers, MPs, and other party officials. They were all held there, and the decision was taken that the two main men, Menderes and the president, Bayer, were the two who would be held in solitary confinement in their own rooms with a guard with them all the time for 24 hours. And yes, I happened to come across one of the officers, one of the young lieutenants who was assigned to guard Menderes through those very, very difficult days. And as I say, Menderes was a very difficult, confused character, and he seems to have found incarceration very, very difficult, not least because the junta was gunning for him above all of them. They were aware that he was by far the most charismatic and the most beloved of the members of the party, and it was him that they wanted to bring down, him that they wanted to defame. And so they made it very hard for him. And then the decision was taken that they were to be tried by Turkey's civil code, and the trial was to take place on this island of Yassıada, where it began in October of 1960 and ran for the best part of a year, in fact. The trials were compared to Nuremberg for their length, and I think it's probably fair to say that while the Turkish civil code was used, everybody was aware that it was leading towards convictions under one of the more controversial articles within the code, which was really about violation of the Constitution. If it was proved that you were violating the Constitution, then the death penalty, at least at the beginning, before they changed it, was mandated as death. So violations of the Constitution were death. So there was a real sense that this was an instrument which was going to be used against, it wasn't quite clear how many members of the former regime, but certainly some of them. So there was a terrible, sinister sense of where this was going, I think, from very early in the proceedings.
Yeah, because in the end, you end up with Prime Minister Menderes being executed, the finance minister, the foreign minister, the president tries to commit suicide, the interior minister, from all accounts, does commit suicide. It's a pretty grim period, and the many Western leaders tried to intervene on their part, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying that just going back to that slide of mine where you saw Menderes with the other gentleman looking at the mosque model, it's very important, those four, because so that's Palatkan and Zorlu, who were also executed a day before Menderes, and Celal Bayar, the president, who would have been, he was the fourth to be condemned to death, but he was spared at the last moment on grounds of his age. Yeah, there was a huge effort by any number of international figures to prevent this happening, and also from a lot of people in Turkey as well, like İsmet İnönü, the opposition leader. He did all he could to persuade the powers that be in the army that this was a terrible thing to do. It would reflect very badly on Turkey, and it would condemn Turkey to an extraordinary, protracted sense of fragility and acrimoniousness in terms of kind of the national political life of the nation. And it seems to me that that's what happened, because in the years since 1960, there have been a series of coups, either attempted or unsuccessful, to the point, it seems to me, and this actually briefly takes me back to my travel writing, I've often found that I've been trying to convey this country for all the reasons of its beauty and of its food, and I'm forever pushing up against this other, darker image, which is somewhat khaki colored, and it's all about tanks on the streets, and it's all about people being rounded up. And it seems to me that nothing has done more damage to Turkey's international reputation than the coups. And it all stems, it seems to me, from the decision to stage that first one. And that's, for me, a terrible, tragic thing. And it also seems to me that coup entrenched the two sides in terms of their positions. Those people who supported Menderes, even old men like Mehmet in his village house on the one side, and the others who are great supporters of Ataturk. A lot of friends of mine, they were born after Menderes died, but their presumption is that he was a traitor. He did everything wrong. He was a terrible man. So Menderes has become this symbol, if you like, and it is a symbol of the polarization of the nation. As I say, he's either the great traditional supporter of Islam and of traditional Turkish life on the one hand, or he's a traitor of Ataturk's vision on the other. And it seems to me that it's actually neither story is true. That what I've tried to do in this book is to present him as a flawed, interesting, complex human being. And I just kind of hope that the two sides can begin to see him a little bit more like that, because it seems to me that there is reconciliation in that. And so long as you continue to see Menderes as absolutely as a hero or a demon, you're never going to move forward. And it's not for me to say as an outsider, but that would be my judgment.
I tended to think you had a sympathetic view of Menderes. And I say that simply because you didn't have a photograph in the book of him hanging underneath the structures that are used in Turkey and with the various crimes posted around his neck. You chose not to do that. Why was that for that reason?
Well, I think so, Chris. I mean, my own feeling is that, putting aside my politics, and I would be more a Kemalist, an Ataturk man than an Erdogan man, no question. It seems to me that one's naturally on the side of the hanged man, especially if he's hanged for political crimes in 1960. He never deserved that to be done. It's a terrible thing to do that to a person, and the consequences are inevitable, aren't they? I mean, you end up with a martyr, which is exactly what's happened. And I think what Menderes has done has actually given power to the likes of Mr. Erdogan, and actually it's but by hanging, by murdering, by executing, you can choose your word, Menderes, the consequence of that has been to actually give so much political gravity and momentum to the people, to the constituencies that Erdogan represents. And to me, that is a sadness. I think that if it comes down to it, the imposition of the secular radicalization from the 1920s was a brilliant idea, but maybe it was imposed too heavily. And I mean, I look at the execution of Menderes as just another aspect of that. The imposition was too heavy, and the outcome, the consequence was, if you like, inevitable.
Yeah, so I have some questions coming in, and they tie into some of the things that I also had on my list of things to talk about. Earlier, before we even got started, I had an email from Hakan asking me about the correlation between the past and today that you have in the book. And Dennis is also asking a similar question. How does what you see what happening in the Menderes period play into what we see happening today? Because in your book, you have a poster, it's in Aydın, and you see Erdogan and Menderes on the posters side by side. So are we repeating history today, I guess?
To a degree, I think so. I mean, the iconography, if you go to an Erdogan rally, you will see plenty of placards whereby the two men are placed alongside each other in similar gestures, in similar postures, and they're both basically stands as, partners in the remaking of a traditional Turkey. That's the idea. Menderes has always played on the idea that he is modeling himself. Erdogan has always played on the idea that he models himself on Menderes. Erdogan was 8 when Menderes was executed, and it seems that the death of Menderes played very heavily, at least on Erdogan's family. So there is that strong connection between the two. And there's also, it seems to me, a strong connection between the two men in terms of their political positions, in terms of their constituencies, almost identical, and in terms of so many things. I mean, there's obviously the tendency to imprison journalists. There's the tendency to invest lots of money in mosque building. There's lots of support for Islam. There's the same authoritarianism. There's the same charisma, it seems to me, in terms of the two men. They're both very, very good with large rallies. So you have so much going on which parallels the two men. And then, of course, you have the coup as well, the attempted coup. The difference, of course, is that it turns out differently. But in so many other respects, the men are uncannily similar in terms of what they represent and what they stand for in Turkish life.
This ties into another question that I had from Hakan as well, because you have the two coups, you have the 1960 coup, you have the 2016 attempted coup. Both are what we would call in coup terminology coups from below. They're not run by the general staff like the 1980 coup in Turkey, for example. But the two groups, although in the 2016 attempted coup, that group tried to model themselves, I think, after the 1960 coup, but they were quite different in terms of who they were and what their aspirations were at the end of the day. A lot of people point to the Gulen movement being behind the 2016 attempted coup. What are your thoughts on who was behind it at the end of the day?
You know, I would sort of, I'm not going to come down on, I'm not going to make a judgment on that because nobody else seems to be able to. And people talk about the fact that it'll take a long time before that comes out. I just don't know. I mean, what I do know, what seems to me really startling about that coup was that it was bungled spectacularly in a way that the 1962 coup, in the 1962 absolutely wasn't. The 1962 coup was a model, an absolute model in doing it right. And the 2016 one was an absolute mess, to the point that nobody was picked up. Not a single minister was picked up. And even Erdogan himself, the attempt to pick him up was an absolute failure. And it ended up with this kind of elite group of paratroopers wandering around Marmaris asking tourists for where the president's hotel was. I mean, it was absolutely chaotic. And that, of course, raises all sorts of questions as to what was really going on. It seems also that there had been no attempt on the part of this group of rebel officers to actually engage clandestinely with the high command and to say, look, this is what we're planning, what do you think? They actually kidnapped them, some of them from a wedding that was taking place in Istanbul, and just kind of assumed they'd go along with it, which of course they didn't. So I don't know. I mean, the fact that it was unbelievably bloody and terrible is unquestionable. It was bloody in a way that the 1960 coup wasn't. But if there is an upside to it, it seems to me this, that even as the coup was taking place, or the attempted coup was taking place, the majority of people, not only those who supported Erdogan, but plenty of those who regarded themselves as his political enemies, came out onto the street to protest against the fact that the coup was happening, as if to say, we don't do it this way anymore. The only way that we're prepared to change our government is at the ballot box. So it was almost like that was a moment when, despite this terrible thing being attempted, it was almost like Turkish democracy had grown up, where the people had said, the army may not be ready to accept this yet, but we, the people, are, and we're going to stand by it. And I thought that was an incredibly important moment. And that gives me hope, possibly unjustified hope, that the country's heading towards a fully fledged and a fully established democracy, and the democratic roots have actually gone in properly in Turkey.
Yeah, so about 2 minutes ago, you said 1960 coup, and I know you meant the 1960 coup. But one thing that people don't often remember is that there were attempted coups in Turkey in 1962 and 63 that failed. And you do mention them in the book. And also that little group of officers that came together in 1960, they were a very divided lot as well, as you point out in the book. I have a question here from Brian. He's asking, in your view, is secularism in Turkey simply a 20th century blip in an otherwise religious Sunni state?
That is a really, really good question, and I wish I had the answer to it. I'm not sure. I mean, every country is different, and you can go to parts of Turkey, particularly in the southwest, and there is a real sense that there is the Aegeanization of those people makes them naturally secular. I don't think it is a blip. I think there's always been a strong kind of sense that drinking raka, for example, is part of the culture, and it's okay. And there's a lot of Balkan influence, which again modifies any kind of Orthodox Sunnism. And you know, the Sunnism of Turkey, which is from the Hanafi school, is very mild anyway. Even under the Ottomans, there was a strong sense that you could get away with a great deal, which you wouldn't be able to get away with in a more strict Sunni Islam state. I just wish, Brian, there was an easy answer to that question. I don't think so. I think that there were plenty of people who were ready for an increased amount of secularism in the modern Turkish state when it was introduced in 1922. But I don't think that the people were carried effectively because it was imposed over harshly. There was almost in the 1930s an element of Bolshevism about it in terms of just how harshly it was imposed upon the people. So I don't know is the short answer. I'm not sure.
We're rapidly running out of time, and I just had a quick question come in. Can you talk about Jamal Bayar's part in all of this, his closeness to Ataturk and his split between Ataturk and Inunu toward the end of Ataturk's life? I guess in 30 seconds, can you talk about Bayar and his relationship here?
Yeah, I mean, I met some of his grandchildren. He was a fascinating man who had actually been prime minister earlier in his life, came from a banking family, was very, very important, I think, earlier in his life. But actually from 1950 onwards, the feeling I get is that although he was the president, the driving force, because he was a much younger man, of course, was Menderes. And I think that Bayar simply went along with what Menderes was proposing. He was a much tougher man than Menderes. He was a much more natural politician. And he took, despite a failed suicide attempt while in incarceration, he dealt with the whole business of the trials on Yasser Ada much more easily than did Menderes. I think what's really fascinating, because I know you've got to stop in a second, but I was just going to say, what is really fascinating about Menderes is that he now was rehabilitated in such an interesting way from 1960 onwards. The army tried to erase all memory of him, and yet over the decades, he just started to appear in all sorts of ways. And he gets an airport named after him, and roads and dams. He's reburied and gets a state funeral in Istanbul, and on it goes. And in fact, Yasser Ada itself, where the trial took place only last year, on the 60th anniversary of the coup, was reopened as a memorial museum to the Democrat Party and to Menderes himself, which just only goes to show how the degree to which his rehabilitation as a public figure, driven by Erdogan and the AK Party, the degree to which that has occurred.
Well, you know, I've done a lot of these Zoom talks, hosting them, and I think this has been the fastest hour I've ever experienced. And I know that we could go on.
So much to say.
There's so much to say, and I can't thank you enough for joining us today. And for those that are listening today, I highly recommend this book. I'm sure many of you do know of a lot about this particular history, but I think the book is fantastic. And the fact that you've gone and spoken to people that are still here, they're in their late 70s and so forth, but they have that personal connection. I think that really also, that brings the book to life. So I highly recommend this book if you want to know more about this period, and also how it ties into some of the events that we see happening in Turkey today. So go out there and buy the book. Jeremy, I have a couple of other quick announcements to make, but I wanted to just give you a second or two if you wanted to say anything before we do go.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I mean, as I say, I can't see any of you, but thank you so much for attending. I know it's at least in Victoria, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. It's 11 o'clock. It's 7 o'clock. It's 7 o'clock at night here. But wherever you are, thank you. And yeah, I mean, just to kind of reiterate how much I continue to love Turkey and continue to explore it. And yeah, all very good wishes to you all. Thank you. Thanks for attending.
Jeremy, having speakers like you at our CIC events is what makes all doing this worthwhile. So thank you on behalf of all of us. And I also wanted to just then mention that we do have some more events coming up soon. We have on the 8th of June, and I'm just going to quickly mention a few, but we will have Ambassador Jennifer May here, who is our ambassador to Brazil. And then we'll shift focus to China with Graham Hutchins talking about his new book, China 1949. So if you are here on the island or across the country, please consider joining us and supporting our work, because we are always on the lookout for new members. So that's it from us. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Jeremy, have a great evening, what's left of it, and I'll be in touch.
Thanks, Chris. Enjoy your day, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.